This is a paper slide presentation on the Renaissance, or the rebirth. The Renaissance began in northern Italy around 1300. One reason northern Europe lagged behind is that France and England were locked in the Hundred Years' War. Overseas trade led to the growth of large city-states in northern Italy. Northern Italy, with many sizable towns, was urban, while the rest of Europe was still rural. Changes in the economy were brought on by 60% of the population dying due to the bubonic plague. Italian city-states ran their own affairs. Each collected taxes and had its own army. Merchants were the wealthiest, most powerful class. Florence became under the rule of one powerful family, the Medici. One reason the Renaissance began in Italy is that the artists and scholars drew inspiration from the ruins of Rome that surrounded them. What classical values continued and what new worldly values were introduced? As scholars studied Greek manuscripts, they became more influenced by classical ideas. This study led to humanism, an intellectual movement focused on human potential and achievements. Most people remained devout Catholics. However, the basic spirit of the Renaissance society was secular, worldly, rather than spiritual, and it was concerned with here and now. Church leaders became patrons of the arts by financially supporting artists. Renaissance merchants and wealthy families were also patrons of the arts. Renaissance writers introduced the idea that all educated people were expected to create art. What new techniques or styles emerged in the arts during the Renaissance? Who was Leonardo da Vinci? Artists portrayed religious subjects, but they used a realistic style copied from classical models. Leonardo da Vinci was a painter, sculptor, inventor, and scientist, a true Renaissance man. Following the new emphasis on individuals, painters began to paint prominent citizens. Renaissance painters used the unique technique of perspective, which shows the three dimensions on a flat surface, like shown in this picture. Why did writers write during the Renaissance? How was Francesco Petrarch and women involved? Renaissance writers wrote either for self-expression or to portray the individuality of their subjects. Francesco Petrarch was one of the earliest and most influential humanists. Some have called him the father of Renaissance humanism. The women writers who gained fame during the Renaissance usually wrote about personal subjects, not politics. How did block printing work? How is the printing press an improvement? The Chinese invented the block printing, in which a printer carved words or letters on a wooden block, inked the block, and then used it to print on paper. In 1045, Bing Sheng invented the movable type. The Chinese writing system contains thousands of different letters or characters. This was good for the Europeans because their letters were small. Around 1440, Johann Gutenberg developed the printing press that incorporated a number of technologies in a new way. This process made it possible to produce books faster and cheaper. He printed a complete copy of the Bible in 1455. The first books were mainly religious ones, and then that turned into things like traveling guides. How was the idea of human dignity influential? How were the arts sponsored? When the 100 Years' War between France and England ended in 1453, many cities grew rapidly. Urban merchants became wealthy enough to sponsor artists. Monarch rulers also began supporting the arts. The Renaissance ideal of human dignity inspired some northern humanists to develop plans for social reforms based on Judeo-Christian values. How did humanist ideas change to Christian humanism? What measures were taken to try to improve society? Italian humanists were interested in classical languages and classical texts. When their ideas reached the North, Northerners used them to examine the traditional teachings of church. Northerners wanted people to live a Christian life. Their criticism of the church was known as Christian humanism. Northerners wanted to reform society. They believed in education. They promoted women with education, promoted co-ed schools. Desiderius Erasmus of Holland and Thomas More of England, they were the close friends. In 1509, Erasmus wrote Praise of Folly. Erasmus thought that to improve society, people should study the Bible. Thomas More wrote the book The Utopia, which translates to means no place. During this time period, not a lot of Europeans could read or write. The very few people who could afford to pay for school only sent their sons. One woman spoke out, Christian de Prison. She was highly educated and was one of the first women writers. She was one of the first women to question the difference between girls and boys. And that is the end of the paper slide Renaissance presentation.